Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Carnegie Endowment. To those of you joining us from outside Washington, D.C., greetings. I'm Ashley Tellis, a senior fellow at the endowment, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion of Elbridge Colby's new book, The Strategy of Denial. The Strategy of Denial was released just yesterday, and I'm delighted that we could host this discussion so soon after its launch. Bridge, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to go first. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ashley. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Of course. As all of you know, Bridge served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development in the Trump administration from 2017 to 2018. During which time he led the most significant revision of US defense strategy in a generation. He clearly has the pedigree to write this book, one that defines how US defense strategy should be reoriented to meet the most pressing challenges of this new century. I suppose there are others who could have written such a book as well, but they didn't. At least not such a masterly analysis. I think I've read most worthwhile books on US defense strategy that have appeared in the last 2 decades. But I've rarely come across one that has the intellectual rigor, the systematicity of analysis, and the sheer ruthlessness of logical reasoning, not to mention the erudition that is found in the Strategy of Denial. I suspect there are few books on US defense strategy that contain discussions that are as involved on the pricing and production of collective goods as there are extended reflections on thumos, or what the classical Greeks call spiritedness. I say this only because I want to emphasize that this is a book that requires, actually demands discussion, because it engages the most important strategic problem facing the United States today. How should America prepare to meet the Chinese challenge? What should it concentrate on? And how should it plan to use force while minimizing the risks that always accompany any confrontation with a nuclear armed state? Bridges' answers to these questions are deeply thought through and provocative in the best sense of the word. They force us to think about the value of both our aims and our strategies. This is a book that will incite vigorous disagreement, and it should. Policy conclusions that pertain to life and death must not be passed over lightly. And a think tank can do no better than to fearlessly midwife such discussions, because as Karl Popper never tired of reminding us, it is only in the relentless confrontation between our conjectures and their refutations that we can hope, if we are lucky, to glimpse a sight of the truth. To join us in this quest, we are joined today by two accomplished discussants. I am thrilled to welcome Jennifer Lind and Chris Burrows to this conversation as well. Jennifer is Associate Professor of Government at Dartmouth and is the author of Sorry States, a work that focuses on the little researched but very important question of the role of apologies in international politics. She has also written extensively on the future of American power, especially in the context of the challenges posed by a rising China. So I'm especially delighted, Jennifer, that you could join us today. Thank you very much for doing so. And of course, I am happy to welcome my friend and sometime co-conspirator and colleague in the US government, Chris Burrows. Chris himself is the author of another marvelously provocative book, The Kill Chain, which examined how the US military should be reconfigured to fight the coming high technology wars. Chris is now head of strategy at Anduril Industries, but before he came to the private sector, he was staff director at the Senate Armed Services Committee and a very close advisor to the late Senator John McCain. Prior to that, He was the chief speechwriter to then US Secretary of State Condi Rice. So I'm delighted in a very special way to welcome Chris back to the Carnegie Endowment, where he spent a few years as a non-resident fellow. So without further ado, let me yield the floor to Bridge to present us with the broad themes of his book, after which we will go to Jennifer and Chris before engaging in a common discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Bridge.
Great. Thank you very much, Ashley, and for hosting the event. And thanks to the Carnegie Endowment. And thank you for those opening remarks. I'm honored, but also the spirit in which you're presiding over this dialogue is exactly what an author could hope for. So I couldn't imagine a better first event than with you and with my good friends and sometimes collaborators, Jenny Lind and Chris Brose. So it's really an honor and a pleasure. So I look forward to getting into the discussion, as you say, to have those differences and disagreements, which I look forward to. But I will first overview the book's argument. The basic impetus behind this book is my grave concern about the mismatch between the granted defense strategies that America is in practice pursuing, a kind of strategy of heavy global engagement, on the one hand, and our actual power on the other. In that context, how should we change our defense strategy be? And what should our defense strategy be? In this context of constrained resources, strategy is actually really important. What I mean by a strategy, though, is not some clever or master plan. Rather, it's a framework, a simplifying logic with which to make choices and prioritize. Without such a logic, there's no coherent way to tell what's important and what's not, and what's a major threat and what's not. In the situation of now scarce resources in which we find ourselves, that's an invitation to disaster. So what is that logic? Well, first, a defense strategy must proceed from an overall grand strategy. In this respect, my argument is that the basic purpose of American foreign policy should be to ensure that no other state can dominate any of the key regions of the world, defined as one of the areas with concentrated wealth and power. In practice, these key regions are in order Asia, Europe, North America itself, and more narrowly the Persian Gulf, which is much smaller but has concentrated oil and gas reserves. By far the most important of these is Asia, which comprises more than 40% of global GDP, and that share is growing. It's set to be half before long. Europe is second at roughly 25%. If a state could dominate one of these regions, it could use that power to coerce Americans over their jobs, way of life, and liberties. Asia is not only the most important region of the world, it's also where the world's most plausible regional hegemon is, China. China comprises roughly half of Asia's power. It therefore stands a real chance of becoming regional hegemon. Russia, by contrast, is not even the most powerful state in Europe, and Iran constitutes only about a fifth of the power of the Middle East. Together, these factors mean that denying China hegemony over Asia must be the cardinal objective of US foreign policy. Asia is the world's most important region, and China its most plausible regional hegemon. How then should the United States seek to deny China this goal, and do so in ways that are consistent with Americans' willpower and strength? First off, let me emphasize that this latter part of this criterion is critical. Denying China regional hegemony over Asia is a very significant American interest, but it's not truly existential for us. It's not likely to be a matter of national survival. Therefore, our strategies need to be proportioned to this reality. We can't have strategies, especially strategies of war and peace, for a very important but not existential interest that involve existential sacrifices. So what's the right strategy for America to deny China regional hegemony in light of this? The core of the answer is an anti-hegemonic coalition. That is a more or less formal grouping of nations banding together to resist China's domination of Asia. Now, this coalition can take any number of forms and members. The condition is simply that enough states be working together to deny China's hegemony over Asia, and that this coalition be resilient to whatever strategy Beijing pursues to its end. The US role in this coalition, however, is critical. Think of it as the external cornerstone balancer. Now, why is this role so important? The reason is that China is just too strong relative to the other states in the region. No other state in Asia could plausibly lead a coalition to balance against Beijing. Each state would be simply too vulnerable to China's strength and ire. This is especially because China has a naturally good strategy to defeat any anti-hegemonic coalition, what I think of as a focused and sequential strategy. This is a strategy of focusing on and isolating coalition members in sequence, progressively weakening the coalition until Beijing can establish its dominance of the region. Now, if states in Asia think they will be vulnerable to this strategy, to Beijing's focused strength and ire, they are much more likely to decide to bandwagon with China, reasoning that they are better off cutting a deal than being punished standing alone. So how do we deal with this problem? A key part of the solution of getting states to stand strong in the face of Beijing's strategy is alliances. Now, alliances are strong signals of resolve, especially by a cornerstone balancer like the United States, to fight to defend another state effectively. Now, they provide queasy states with the confidence that they will be defended against China by the big heavy in the coalition. In effect, we can think of them as the steel in the spine of the anti-hegemonic coalition. The issue with alliances, though, is that they also entangle. That's their whole point. They put the cornerstone balancer's credibility on the line so it has a real incentive to fight. If it doesn't, its credibility will suffer. And credibility does matter, not so much in a general global sense, but particularly in what I think of as a differentiated sense. Nervous states are naturally going to wonder whether the United States is actually going to come to their aid, given how strong China is. If these nervous Asian states see America balk at effectively defending a country against China that Washington is allied with in Asia, they'll quite reasonably wonder whether they too will be left out to dry if the going gets too tough for the United States. So this discussion brings us to the importance of a defense perimeter. Now, this sounds like an archaic subject, something from the 19th century, but it's actually highly relevant. The US defense perimeter represents those countries that we're committed to defend, those we've staked our differentiated credibility on. So who is in and who is out is really important. The problem is that we face polar risks of undercommitting and overcommitting. If we undercommit and bring in too few countries, the coalition will be too weak and China will become regionally dominant. If we overcommit, on the other hand, we risk becoming entangled in unfavorable and sapping wars, undermining our strength and the American public's will. So where should we draw the line? Some countries are obvious. On the one hand, you can't plausibly have a meaningful coalition in Asia without, say, Japan and Australia. On the other hand, Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan are weak and indefensible for us. Some, like India, may not even want an alliance. So the rub of the matter comes down to places like Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and a few others in East and Southeast Asia. But how difficult, costly, and risky to defend are these countries? This is a critical question, and this is one of military strategy, of how to fight wars. If we can develop and implement a military strategy that brings the costs and risks of defending those more exposed countries down, then we can bring more states into our defense perimeter without violating our core duty to keep the risks and costs for the American people proportionate to the importance of the interests at stake for them. This right military strategy for the United States is a denial defense. A denial defense is one that denies China its ability to use military force to achieve its political objectives. In particular, it focuses on denying China the efficacy of its best military strategy. We need to focus on Beijing's best strategy, not its most likely or its most destructive, because its best is the most gainful for it and the most dangerous to our interests in real and practical terms. In light of this, Beijing's best military strategy to advance its focused and sequential overall strategy is a fait accompli, especially against a vulnerable coalition member like, say, the Philippines, Vietnam, or above all, Taiwan. A fait accompli would involve Beijing seizing and occupying one of these countries' key territory before the broader coalition could come to their effective aid. Beijing would then present the coalition with a new set of facts, try to do the far more difficult task of reversing these facts at great cost and risk, or accept the new reality and let it go and deal with it. It's a very good and therefore very dangerous strategy. The fait accompli works best for Beijing because it leverages appropriately the respective advantages of both direct force and persuasion or deterrence. It uses direct force to subordinate the targeted country, but then primarily relies on deterrent threats to dissuade the rest of the coalition from coming to the target's effective aid. At the same time, the fait accompli exhibits restraint, therefore enticing other coalition members to believe they can give up their targeted coalition partner in hopes they'll be spared. If Beijing can make this fait accompli strategy work against, say, Taiwan, it could replicate it against another vulnerable coalition member like the Philippines or Vietnam. Beijing would not likely have to go after each and every coalition member, though. If it could use it against a few states successfully, especially US allies, given the central importance of America's differentiated credibility to the whole coalition, that would very likely make clear the coalition was hollow. It would then collapse and Beijing would become the regional hegemon. Now, the purpose of a denial defense is to prevent this from working. The denial defense strategy does so by focusing on denying Beijing's victory conditions, its theory of victory, if you will. Now, this is a negative criterion. It focuses on denying the enemy's goals, not positively attaining our own. But this is actually good. It means a lower bar. As long as the embattled ally can hold on, the coalition wins and Beijing basically loses. Accordingly, the United States and its partners in the coalition can deny China's best strategy in one of two ways. This stems from the fact that for it to succeed, a fait accompli must involve Beijing both seizing and holding its target's key territory. So the US and its partners can deny China's ability to seize, say, Taiwan's key territory in the first place, or its ability to hold it. If the United States and its partners can do this, China will be forced to give up or to try to escalate to reverse its defeat. In this respect, though, it will bear what I think of as a heavy burden of escalation. Now, this is a critical concept in my argument. Both the United States and China possess survivable nuclear arsenals, as Ashley pointed out. Therefore, any war between them would very likely remain limited because of the profound incentives for both sides to achieve that outcome. But the burden of escalation would play a decisive role in forming the actual limits and determining the resolution of such a limited war. The side that could force the other to have to escalate in a dramatic way, thereby increasing the other side's resolve and drawing international support to it, would benefit greatly. That's the burden of escalation. To be concrete, if China had been denied its goals in a fait accompli, it would face a choice. It could escalate. It could do so vertically, using greater violence and attacking more sensitive targets against the United States and other combatants, or horizontally, attacking a wider number of countries in more places. Or it could pursue both. But neither of these would change the facts on the ground on, say, Taiwan. At the same time, they would demonstrate Beijing's aggressiveness and unreasonableness, catalyzing Americans' righteous anger, FDR's flashing sword of vengeance, and thus harsh responses, while eliciting greater and more active third-party support and probably intervention on the coalition's behalf. Now, as with the victim struggling against a boa constrictor, in this context, every attempt by Beijing to struggle out of its predicament would make that predicament worse. Or, alternatively, Beijing could give up, not total surrender or defeat or American troops marching through Beijing, but it could, give up to fight another day or lick its wounds in hopes of trying again later. This would be a satisfactory outcome for the coalition, to return to the coalition's fundamental victory criterion. Now, what, however, if we can't make a denial defense work, though? This is a serious prospect. As Admiral Studeman, the director of intelligence at Indo-PACOM, recently pointed out, we may be too late vis-a-vis China, and I think he was suggesting particularly vis-a-vis Taiwan. The key in this context would be generating the greater resolve needed to win that war, needed to either going the greater distance to defend an embattled ally or even to liberate it. We would need to activate the resolve to actually bring the coalition's latent power actively to bear. The big question there is how. My argument is via what I call the binding strategy. This is basically to deliberately array and develop our and our partners' forces in such a way that China is compelled, if it wants to implement the focused and sequential strategy, to appear so menacing, aggressive, and ambitious that it will actually catalyze the will of the fuller coalition to defeat its effort. In a sense, it's to compel China to have to do what Japan did in late 1941, early 1942, alienate everyone and bring everyone in against it rather than salami slice. If we do this right, China will see that it has no good way to implement the focused and sequential strategy and should be deterred. So what are the implications of this argument for a denial defense for our contemporary defense strategy? Well, the top priority for the American defense establishment must be to ensure that China cannot subordinate a US ally or Taiwan in Asia. The first priority should be ensuring Beijing cannot subordinate Taiwan because it is Beijing's best target within our defense perimeter. At the same time, the United States should maintain a strong nuclear deterrent and a focused but effective counterterrorism posture. Ideally, it should also maintain a missile defense posture sufficient to defeat a North Korean or Iranian attack if that doesn't prove too costly. On the other hand, in order to best employ its now scarce resources, the United States should not size, shape, or posture its military to deal simultaneously with any other scenario alongside a war with China over Taiwan or another ally in Asia. U.S. allies, especially in NATO Europe, as well as in the Middle East, must carry the primary burden of their conventional defense. In closing, this is a book about war, about preparing for it, and how to win it at a reasonable level of cost and risk. But the ultimate goal of this strategy is to be able to come to a decent peace, indeed an acceptable détente with China. Achieving this, however, requires firm and focused action and accepting the risk and distinct possibility of war. Only this will earn us the decent peace that we desire and deserve. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Bridge. Why don't I yield the floor to Jennifer to offer us her response to the thoughts that Bridge just laid out. Thank you, Jennifer.
Hi, thanks, Ashley. And thank you for having me as part of this discussion. I'm really excited to be here. And like clockwork, the gentleman with the leaf blower has shown up outside my office. So he took his cue without even knowing it. We'll see how we do here. The book, as Ashley said, is just a marvel of analytic clarity, of what did you say, ruthless logic. And it was a true pleasure to read. I kind of gobbled it up because, again, it was so refreshing in its very single-minded focus on the kind of chess game that we're looking at. So I'd like to make a few key points today. My first point is regarding the idea of how likely is this kind of anti-hegemonic coalition that Bridge is saying is going to, or it would like to see form. And I'm coming to this right away because I'm an East Asia specialist, and so I'm particularly interested in the politics of the region. So again, in the book, Bridge argues that regional countries will be fearful of China. He argues that Chinese dominance in the region will pose what he calls an acute threat and could very well mean the end of those states as independent entities. So those are pretty serious words. So again, I'd like to push, from my perspective, I'd like to push into this from the standpoint of exploring the likelihood of a regional balancing. So it might certainly be true that China could someday pose that kind of threat to regional countries. But these days, countries in the region certainly don't seem to believe that's the case. Otherwise, they would be behaving a whole lot differently. Many of these countries are tilting toward China, or in Japan's case, doing not a whole lot to balance. Given the stopping power of water, given all the other factors that would restrain China from a full-on assault against its neighbors, is it really true that Chinese regional hegemony would create such a dire threat to South Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, and so on? And this is important because if they don't perceive the threat to be as serious as Bridge does, then they won't want to pay the costs and assume the risks of joining an anti-hegemonic coalition. So Bridge points out in the book that the threat to these countries might not necessarily be to direct territory, but also Chinese regional dominance could undermine their autonomy in really important ways. But here, again, as an East Asia person, I want to remind us that many of these countries, and specifically thinking about Japan and South Korea, already made huge compromises in their autonomy in order to align with the current dominant country in the region, the United States. So hosting US military forces, enduring noise and accidents and environmental damage and crime, and often just diplomatically in that relationship, feeling like their needs and preferences weren't being taken into account and they weren't being listened to. So they compromised their autonomy in these ways because they decided the benefits of alliance outweighed the costs. Now, Bridge loves America, and I love America, but I want to hear more about why he thinks Asian countries would be so much more likely to prefer sacrificing their autonomy to the United States rather than China. Because preventing war and economic punishment from Beijing are pretty big benefits, tilting them toward the China side of the ledger, or at least encouraging them to sit out this great game. So I'm guessing Bridge can make a case for this, and again, maybe drawing on something about the proximate country being a more serious threat. But again, I'd be interested in hearing him make it. Because, of course, there's another alternative view among East Asianists that's floating around out there that says these countries will actually be quite comfortable living in China's sphere as they did for so long in the China-led tributary system. So again, my first point is to challenge this idea, to question whether an anti-hegemonic coalition will indeed emerge, given that perhaps the threat in the eyes of regional countries is not so serious. My second comment is a smaller point related to the book's discussion of Taiwan. And here, this is just a small piece of the book, but I wanted to raise it in particular because I really think, well, it was a provocative one, and I really think that we need to be talking about Taiwan a whole lot more than we're currently doing in the United States foreign policy establishment from a variety of angles. The military balance, the strategic utility, the alliance partnerships that might be engaged, and then certainly U.S. policy, which is the point that Bridge got to in the book here. So in the book, Bridge wrote a whole lot of very sensible things about American credibility, which I really appreciated reading after reading a lot of highly alarmist things about U.S. credibility in the wake of the pullout from Afghanistan. So I like his approach, which he calls differentiated credibility in the book. It's very sensible. So Bridge argues that the U.S. commitment toward Taiwan is too vague, and that in order to create a credible deterrent, the U.S. would need to issue a clear promise to protect Taiwan. And of course, people all know that that's a big departure from our current policy of strategic ambiguity. So perhaps Bridge is right that given the growth of Chinese military power, recently you could also point to kind of more threatening actions on Beijing's part. Perhaps to create a credible deterrent, the U.S. does need to bolster its deterrent, needs to bolster its credibility in some way. And so perhaps issuing such a promise would improve American credibility in this fashion. The problem is that the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity is driven by multiple goals, only one of which is maintaining a high level of U.S. credibility in Beijing's eyes. It's also driven by a desire to restrain Taiwan from declaring independence and thus provoking the very war we had hoped to avoid. So as readers, we wonder, how would Bridge balance the need to credibly deter Beijing and reassure Taiwan against that need to restrain Taiwan? Because wouldn't such a U.S. promise be a green light to Taiwan to make a move, to take care of this problem, given that it's facing a closing window of opportunity as Beijing's power only increases? I want to say one more thing about Taiwan that I'll get to in a minute. My third point is about whether or not the threat that we face from Chinese dominance can actually be addressed through a military strategy. And Bridge has given us such an amazingly well-explained, sensible military strategy. But the question is a military strategy what we need? He's totally right to be talking about the U.S. national security implications of Chinese dominance of this incredibly rich region. But again, I'm certain how Chinese dominance of this region would come about militarily. In other words, what would China do militarily to create such dominance? So when we factor in geography, when we factor in the presence of escalation, China will likely find the overt use of military force very difficult. And that's not even throwing in the ideas of international opprobrium and economic disruption, the costs from that, and so on. So for all these reasons, it seems that China would seek to establish regional dominance through a non-kinetic strategy, relying on different instruments than military ones. And in fact, it really already seems to be wielding such instruments with some frequency, increasing its influence in global governance, trying to get ahead in the race over standards, economic coercion, and acquiring political influence. So again, Bridges' strategy of denial is a military strategy, when I wonder if the threat is actually more non-military in nature. So for example, how are we going to use F-35s to support South Korea when Beijing sanctions Lotte Hotel at Chinese ports? And as part of this, to come back to Taiwan, I found myself wondering, and this is, as I was saying, we need to debate Taiwan issues more than we're doing, and I think this is a key one. I wonder if we aren't overemphasizing China's military threat to Taiwan and failing to plan for, again, non-kinetic coercive threats to Taiwan's autonomy. So the Chinese succeeded in consolidating control over Hong Kong through non-military means, through very targeted arrests and use of force and so on. It didn't require a big, massive crackdown. It happened, and then people said, "Oh, this is impossible. It would never do that because there's going to be so much upheaval, and again, the world will push back." The world didn't push back, and Hong Kong is controlled by China. Will this same playbook be one that Beijing adopts toward Taiwan? It would have to be a slightly different playbook. Perhaps it's a variant of the Crimea model. But again, would it rely on largely economic, political, and diplomatic action rather than military action to establish control over Taiwan? Changes would be incremental over time to reduce the likelihood of pushback. And again, Beijing would be using carrots such as investment and loans to silence potential critical countries and to drive a wedge in ASEAN or European responses. So again, there's a whole raft of potential non-military tools that Beijing might be relying on to establish control over Taiwan, to reduce Taiwan's autonomy. To conclude, let me say I really enjoyed, as I said, reading this book. I don't like sit down and dive into books as much as I used to, and I did that with this one. Again, it is a marvel of clear argumentation and deductive reasoning. And the book cuts through a lot of politics and uncertainty, sometimes in a really helpful way. For example, there's a big question of how ambitious will China be? And Bridge organizes a discussion of that really nicely and manages to kind of dispatch with that massive uncertainty, which have really tripped up other studies in the past, allowing him to move on to his question of interest in I thought, a really compelling way. So again, my main reaction, and this is coming from the place of the regional specialist, is to say this is a really strong and yet narrow contribution to the discussion about East Asian security and U.S. strategy toward the region. When I say strong and narrow, I don't mean that as an insult. This is all we can hope to do as scholars. It is my dream to write a strong, narrow contribution to the discussion. So, and I'm not saying, oh, Bridge, you should have had a volume 2 or a part 2 or, whatever, where you deal with the politics. But the book does feel like it's this kind of elegant chess game or a game of risk, and the argument develops logically and beautifully, but in that vacuum without politics. And so for that reason, for all the reasons that we've been praising the book, you need that book on your bookshelf, audience. So the book needs to be on your bookshelf. See, wait, how do I do that? There it is. There's the book on my bookshelf. But it also needs to be joined with books about the region's politics, analysis of China's ambitions, of Korean hedging, growth, and of Japanese will. Bridge, I congratulate you on this amazing achievement, and thank you again for including me in this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for actually bringing us into contact with reality, because at the end of the day, Bridges' arguments will stand and fall not on their internal coherence, but whether they can actually help us solve real problems in the real world. So I'm hoping that when we get to the discussion, we will have some of these, some of these conversations. But I will also complicate things further by asking Bridge at that point, a methodological question, since he has grounded the book so self-consciously in a methodological, framework that we all know as political realism. But let's keep that for the conversation. Let me bring Chris Brose into this discussion. Chris, over to you, please.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ashley. It's really great to be with you and Dr. Lind and Bridge today. Just going to agree with everything that has been said to start. This is an incredibly important book. I'm glad that Bridge wrote it. I'm glad that Carnegie is providing a forum to discuss it. These are ideas that need to be discussed and debated openly and honestly. Because as Bridge makes clear, as Ashley makes clear, and Dr. Lind makes clear, the stakes of this are incredibly massive. And I would agree. I think Bridge has written a definitive work on U.S. defense strategy that should guide our strategic competition with China for the years to come. I think the way Dr. Lind put it, of strong and narrow, is probably apt. And I say this as someone who specializes in writing weak and broad books. So my hat is off to you, Bridge. What I would say here is I think, what I like about this is that Bridge sees the world clearly, and what I would say correctly. The rise of China is a world-altering event. It's not just another foreign policy challenge. I think he sees the United States clearly, that we are losing military dominance that we've enjoyed for a generation, and we're unlikely to recover that dominance. I think these are two significant contentions that are fundamentally different than the assumptions that have underwritten U.S. strategy, arguably since the end of the Cold War. What I like about this is sort of Bridges' conservatism. I mean that in sort of like the Burkean sense, not in a partisan sense. Denial is a limited objective. It's not a world-ordering ambition. Casting the U.S. as a status quo power, I think, is accurate. Putting the defense back in defense strategy is the right way to think about this for the United States that we now live in. And I really like the continued emphasis on strategy as something that has to be bearable by the American people. All of this I think is right. And while I appreciate the sort of the conservatism of a lot of these arguments, my main question, kind of what undergirds the comments I'll make today, is actually whether Bridge is being radical enough. So with that, just to kind of tick through a few thoughts and really look forward to the conversation. The first is, to echo what Ashley said, and what Dr. Lind said, the sort of the timelessness of this analysis is something I find very refreshing. I think all too often in works like this, people overlook the kind of elemental aspects of war and peace, geography, honor, tragedy, power, conquest. But I think there are times here where it feels like, Bridge may not adequately be accounting for how things actually have changed or are changing, primarily with respect to technology. And I'm a big believer in not criticizing the book that someone didn't write, and that was not the focus of Bridge's book. So I say this mostly just to kind of raise questions for discussion. A lot of the book comes down to power and power politics. But the way I think about technology is that power is no longer simply a function, as it has historically been, of the size of a nation's population, economy, and territory. That stuff matters incredibly. But what modern technology is doing is really democratizing access to power, especially military power. And this isn't just about precision strike weapons and cyber, which we have gone over a lot before. It's access to space and low-cost sensing and artificial intelligence and autonomy. Where these are capabilities that scale independently of having lots of money and lots of people. And the net effect of this is I think it's redefining the nature of power in international relations by delinking it from what has traditionally been the sources of it. So when we look at this, I think the implications are that some small and weak states could actually now mobilize significant military power. That's something that U.S. strategy is going to have to account for better or for worse. A state like Russia, which I think Bridge correctly characterizes as sort of economically marginal, demographically imploding and sort of generally declining, could nonetheless pose significant threats to core U.S. interests in ways that we may have to honor in our defense strategy, perhaps more than he's suggesting. It also means that China, a massive and rich and developed country that is also producing world-leading technologies, advanced technologies, could actually be a much, much bigger challenge than many of us have described, that even Bridge is describing. All of this kind of points to a second issue, which very much echoes the comments that Dr. Lin just made. Bridge talks about China's best military strategy and sort of suggests that there's something about it that should be objectively knowable to China and to the US, almost to a certain extent kind of determined by broader factors and forces. And my concern here is that it seems to discount the chances of disruption, that China may just be playing a different game than the one the United States is assuming it will play, that we may be assuming it's going to play a different game or have a different best military strategy, and they may be right and we may be wrong. And I would submit this is actually kind of the story of the past 25 years. We got China wrong. The ends that it was seeking, the ways in which it would use power, including military power, and many of the means that it was developing on timelines qualitatively and quantitatively far beyond what many Americans assumed would be possible. I think Bridge does a really good job of describing that power projection, especially across vast expanses of ocean and sky, is actually really hard. It favors defenders, who, or at least defenders who have made themselves defensible. So no one should assume that a conquest of Taiwan by China or the Philippines would be a cakewalk. I think the question here, is are we really so sure that limited wars to fracture the anti-hegemonic coalition is actually China's best military strategy? Kind of to Dr. Lin's point, and I won't belabor it here, why wouldn't they be seeking to use non-traditional means, especially military means, to pull off kind of a more sophisticated version of what Russia has done in Ukraine? This would still be, a fait accompli, just of a very different kind on a much longer timeline, rather than sort of traditional power projection. It would focus more on kind of erosion of governance, erosion of security over time, and essentially just kind of, absorbing it into its orbit. Would that not be, if not the best military strategy, the best overall strategy for China, that would then sort of inform the military elements of that strategy? Final point really gets to the questions of implications of this, which Bridge gets into, not in detail, which is why I'd love to try to maybe draw some of this out in the questions. And this is where I go back to the point about radicalism. As I sort of kind of take all of the implications that come from the book that flow from this analysis of China and Chinese and US power, it sort of ends up in a place that I would suggest is relatively familiar for us. The US defense perimeter and alliance architecture aren't really changed. We're not fundamentally altering security commitments in other regions, Europe with NATO, or aside from kind of withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan. We're seeking to kind of work with more capable partners in Asia, such as India, Vietnam, to make them part of that balancing coalition. We want allies in Asia and Europe to kind of do more for their own defense. We want to keep North Korea and Iran at bay through, kind of deterrence, missile defense, and diplomacy, and maintain a robust nuclear weapons capability and counterterrorism capabilities. It feels very much like where we have been from the standpoint of strategy. Again, with that sort of marked, kind of departure with respect to the comments that Bridge makes so well about Iraq and Afghanistan. I think here, what I would sort of ask is whether the implications of that really are as sort of significant as some may assume. For example, the military capabilities that we have in CENTCOM may actually not be as relevant to the Indo-Pacific theater as many assume. We may actually want aircraft carriers off the coast of Afghanistan, not off the coast of China. I think these are things that are kind of worth pulling out, in terms of, are we actually not changing as much about, the implications of our strategy as Bridge is letting on. And, the thing that I would want to kind of end with, I guess, is just kind of a few thoughts or questions in that respect. Not sort of making the case for any of these, but mostly just to say, starting from Bridge's analysis, are these not the kind of more radical conclusions that we're kind of led to ineluctably? Bridge talks about collective defense in Asia, kind of an Asian NATO, the idea of perhaps a formal alliance with a country like India. Is that something that we should actually be pursuing? Is it possible? Is it desirable? Is it possible and desirable if the United States were willing to do things or make concessions, concede things of ours that traditionally, politically, bureaucratically, we really haven't been able and willing to do, but now we may have to do. Similarly, there's kind of a thread in Bridges' book about kind of Russia perhaps being part of this anti-hegemonic coalition. Well, if we push that further, would that not suggest that maybe we need to overhaul completely the way we've been thinking about Russia to really enlist it as part of an anti-hegemonic coalition, such as changing U.S. policy toward Ukraine, changing U.S. sanctions that have been put in place, not just with Ukraine, but as a result of Russian activities in the 2016 election, possibly even rethinking NATO commitments that have been made over past decades. With respect to strategy, a very good friend of mine says the difference between a strategist and a dentist is that when a dentist hits a nerve, they stop drilling. A strategist hits a nerve and sort of doubles down. To that end, would the better strategy for the United States actually be to focus on the most neuralgic elements, of kind of China's pain points here, such as the internal legitimacy of the CCP, divisions within the CCP, social cohesion, not to suggest that we should start firing these shots at China, but rather to sort of, build capabilities that, are demonstrable to China as a way of deterring the kinds of actions that we're talking about here, that Dr. Lind referred to, that start to get into how China's wielding kind of non-hard power tools, non-kinetic tools, as a way of generating kind of real deterrence by virtue of focusing on the things that China is most neuralgic about and cares the most about, rather than trying to sort of blunt their conventional military power projection. Two final questions and look forward to conversation. A denial defense, I think, is right, but is it actually a lot more taxing than Bridge is suggesting? And are we, the United States and the United States military, actually far from being as ready as we would need to be to carry that off? Put aside whether allies and partners, are actually making enough and the right kinds of investments in their own defense to execute the kind of porcupine strategy that Bridge calls for. I would argue they're not. This is going to take an enormously heavy toll on the United States. It's going to, I think, as Bridge sort of suggests at one point in the book, extend to things like mainland strikes against China, which I would argue is probably going to result in mainland strikes by China against the United States using conventional capabilities. Is this something that we are, ready and capable of doing, or are the implications of that logic for the ways that we're going to have to change our thinking and change our approach to military power pretty radical in terms of the ends to which they lead? And then finally, I think the question that sort of is central to all of Bridges' analysis is Taiwan. This is very much where he in the book kind of draws the line in the sand for the United States. And I think, again, the question that the logic of his argument leads to is that necessary? Is it achievable? And is it even desirable? Again, there's a question of, is this something that the United States can pull off? An actual defense of Taiwan 100 miles off the coast of a near-peer competitor that's rapidly developing advanced military capabilities. I think there's also a question that Bridge, kind of alludes to, or, some of the logic kind of points to with respect to desirability. He makes the argument, as Dr. Lind mentioned, about differentiated credibility, which I like a lot. And I think it's a refreshing way of describing how countries in Asia are not going to look at the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan as the sky is falling, but may actually see that as they're going to be getting more American power in Asia. So this is a net benefit. I think we can ask the question, well, does that logic not extend inside of Asia? Which Bridge seems to suggest that it doesn't. Would a country like Japan or Australia not look at a change of U.S. commitment vis-a-vis Taiwan is actually giving them greater differentiated credibility, greater U.S. commitment, greater balances of U.S. power to defend them, and sort of a narrower but still very robust anti-hegemonic coalition? Again, not suggesting that I'm in favor of any of these particular courses of action, mostly just raising them as questions that I think flow from the really superb analysis that Bridge has done. Because I think the implications for how the U.S. force is sized and shaped and postured as a result of how these questions get answered are wildly different, and in some ways, very desirable, in some ways problematic and possibly unachievable. So again, I really enjoyed the book. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with everybody here today, and really look forward to the question and answer.
Thanks, Chris. That was absolutely wonderful. I thought both Jennifer and you laid out a huge menu of questions, which I want to get to at least boil down to 3 issues, because I'm also cognizant of time and I want to bring people in from the audience. I want to start, though, by asking a sort of methodological question. And I alluded to that in my opening remarks, as Jennifer did too. The logic of your argument is internally consistent because it flows from certain very clearly defined premises, right? Once you accept those premises, the logic follows actually quite inexorably. And people can sort of quibble on the margins, but you see exactly where you're going. So the intellectual analog to the practical problem that Jennifer asked for me is this. Since your argument is so theory dependent and so dependent on one particular conception of international politics, how do you persuade others in the public space who may not be votaries of the worldview that you have intellectually, that the arguments that you make actually have exactly those profound implications that you assert, right? And that, to my mind, is the intellectual analog of the question that Jennifer is asking, which is, in practical terms, how do you deal with the fact that countries may not see the Chinese threat as you do, because they're looking at it perhaps in different ways, perhaps they are, there are competing interests that they are juggling with, and so on and so forth. So how do you address the question that methodological rigor, while bringing a certain set of benefits, also ends up limiting our ability to treat other variables as significant for purposes of your conclusion? I just want to throw that into the mix, precisely because you have a very self-consciously theoretical book. I mean, you're not just sort of dabbling in public policy. You're anchoring it in a certain vision of international relations and what the implications are. So I think that's one set of questions. The second set of questions that, and I wanted to address the practical implications which Jennifer raised, which is, even if Chinese dominance is the goal, is the military strategy sufficient to neutralize that dominance? And how likely is it that others share that same vision, that military dominance is the goal and therefore will respond in a way that you want? So that's a set of questions I want to talk about. I want to come back to the questions of Taiwan, not because of the sort of intestinal detail, because we can discuss that forever, but the 2 issues, and this comes also partly from a question asked from the audience from my own colleague Stephen Wertheim at Carnegie, who says your strategy is meant to counter China's best strategy, but not necessarily its likeliest one, right? And that's something both Chris and Jennifer have alluded to. So what is your response to Chinese threats to Taiwan that may not be high-end kinetic threats, but can be just as devastating? And there is a second variant, actually, that is in your own book that I found actually very interesting, which is, even if the Chinese decided to mount a high-end kinetic threat to Taiwan, can they do it without crossing the boundaries of binding? That is, can they do it without having to attack Japan, without having to attack US bases, in the Philippines and so on and so forth? In other words, limit the war just to Taiwan and then frustrate your entire coalitional strategy. Because if I heard Jennifer right, there is an even chance that some countries in Asia will say, Taiwan is a special case. We don't have to treat this as the litmus test of Chinese ambition. So forget about a hegemonic coalition. Right? So could you imagine Chinese power growing to the point where they don't need to attack others beyond just Taiwan? And then what are the implications for your strategy? That's the second. The third question is, a broader one, which is, what good is strategy for anyway, right? In this sort of dynamic environment where Chris is alluding to, which is like disruption on scales that are transcending the resource endowments of states, what he called the democratization of violence, and so on and so forth. How does your preferred strategy work in this kind of an environment where there are perpetual surprises and the clear linkages between the old question of economic endowments and military effectiveness may not hold? I know what the realist answer is, but I would still like you to sort of address that question, and and then we'll take it from there. So why don't we start with you, Bridge, and then we'll.
Great. Well, I just want to say, and I'm grateful to you all for your very kind remarks. It really means a great deal to me, and more than anything, that you've taken the book in exactly the spirit it was offered. And actually, what I would say is the most satisfying part of this is that you are all using the framework of the book to come to somewhat different and to interrogate the conclusions. So I don't pretend to have the right answers based on the logic. I'm trying to offer, I think, as Jenny, you put it, a rigorous framework that can be used. And I come to some conclusions, hopefully relatively tentatively, but transparently, that I welcome people to come. And I think Taiwan is a great example, and it's dependent. And I think this is exactly the kind of conversation I would hope that this book would spur. So it's tremendously gratifying on many levels, but more than anything else, vocationally, as in this is what I've spent. Chris and I were joking earlier on. A friend of mine says, book goes from a labor of love to hard labor. So you all know this, but it's on the other side, to have it be taken seriously in this way is a tremendous honor and pleasure. So I'm going to try to. It's such a rich. I was just trying to process it intellectually, even just at a minimum. Maybe I'll go in reverse order since it's freshest from Ashley. And just try to be telegraphic given the time constraints. But I think it is a realist book, and I hope that gives it a parsimony and a clarity, hopefully, that people can engage with. It doesn't explain all of the world, but I think the main thing that I would say to those out there, and I saw Stephen's question briefly on the screen, I think the point is this should serve liberal ends, in broadly construed liberal. And I think that the goal here is not a sort of a realist outcome in some normative sense, but really to allow us as Americans to shape our own future. And so, this actually explains to me, not to get into some of the old battles, but a lot of the differences between, say, realists and neoconservatives seem to have collapsed in the last couple of years, because I think both sides realize that China is a great threat, emphasizing different elements, and you come to different conclusions about strategies and so forth. But I'm hopeful that this strategy can appeal to others. And I think it gets to another point about that, Ashley, that you and Jennifer were intimating. I think strong but narrow is what I hoped. I think that the idea of this book is to come up, or to help come up with the right defense strategy, certainly the framework that provides the critical underlying military basis for denying China's ability to dominate that way, which would work and would make everything else irrelevant, given the paramountcy of violence as a coercive tool. But the goal of the book is actually to make violence irrelevant, in the way that, by the late 80s or the 80s, people didn't think violence was very likely in Europe. That's our goal here. But I do worry that, for a variety of reasons, that China will see, and this gets to maybe one of Jenny's points as well, that will see the military instrument as very valuable if it does pursue regional hegemony. And I think, frankly, they provide examples faster than I can come up with them. If you look how they're treating India or Australia or Taiwan or Japan, et cetera, Vietnam, it's there before our eyes. If that's the case, I don't think they can grow their way. They can't hide and bide their way to regional dominance. They can't trick countries into that status, because countries will be able to balance. And even even bombing and military blockades don't work very well, let alone economic sanctions. Look how much trouble we've had turning those into real coercive efficacy. And I think the Chinese are finding that even right now in Australia. They're having limited results on their economic sanctions on Australia, which is a small economy, highly dependent on China. So that's good, in that it actually makes the economic piece, a little more sanguine, but then that's going to increase China's incentives to use military force. And this is where, Jenny's point about will most countries really be that afraid, and I think your point too, Ashley, I think it's a very valid question. In fact, I think I try to go into it in the book, but there's a very cutting line of Lee Kuan Yew about a certain Southeast Asian country that he says this country always bends before the wind blows. But that's true of a lot of countries in Asia. And I think, frankly, Taiwan may be that way, to get to Chris's points. And so I'm worried about that. But that actually, if we don't want regional hegemony, Chinese regional hegemony for our own purposes, that makes our role as the external cornerstone balancer and the leader of this coalition all the more important. And I think in practice, we're likely to have a couple pillars. Hopefully Japan, there's been some movement in the last few weeks. You and I wrote a piece to try to help move that needle earlier this year. Yeah, right. And I think they seem to be hopefully not too late, but the Taiwans have increased defense spending. The Vietnamese are strong, the Indians are strong. So I think that's, I'm more sanguine. This region a lot better than I do, but I am somewhat sanguine. But I think your point about the fact that they might accept a tributary relationship is absolutely right. It's absolutely right. I mean, not only for us, but for going back, but that makes it all the more urgent for us to take action. I think let me just actually talk about the issue of Taiwan, because I think it's an excellent point. I mean,
Rich, can I interrupt?
Sure.
I just want to follow up on what you just said, because it goes to a question that Jennifer asked quite sort of penetratingly, which is, what if the Chinese conception of dominance or hegemony does not lend itself to solutions, to military solutions? And that is, in a sense, implicit in a lot of these discussions, right? Because many of the regional states recognize that there is some kind of Chinese dominance sort of out there. They can live with it as long as it does not involve manifest, clear, and present dangers to their own physical survival, right? So people accommodate to different kinds of preponderance. Mm-hmm. If China does not exercise coercive preponderance, which involves conquest of states, the abridgment of their physical security, I think the question that is at the back of people's minds is, so what will your analysis tell us about addressing that predicament? And it's a question that also comes from the floor. Mm-hmm. Paul here has asked this in a different way by saying, what is your vision of the Chinese notion of hegemony? And what are its implications for your theory? Sorry, but...
No, that's a really good question, Ashley, and all of you. I mean, I think that's not really hegemony. So, I mean, I think the physical conquest is a tool for China, not the goal, kind of a Genghis Khan style, but rather a dominance over the internal affairs, the critical, not only military and security, but economic and political decisions. So, I mean, I think the kind of list of demands that China's issued to Australia, those are a taste. And I think the evidence suggests that regional states actually don't want that. I mean, even it's far before direct physical attack or their death that regional states will resist. I mean, of course, you would know this infinitely better than I, but India has ejected dozens of Chinese apps from their market and other steps and fought them on the line of actual control. Vietnam, of course, we've had a long experience of them. Not to say that Vietnam isn't prepared to accept a certain amount of, I think, a measured form of hegemony. But I think that form we can live with, actually. And that's actually, frankly, probably the outcome of my strategy is, yes, there is going to be substantial Chinese influence. It's one of the reasons why China, at the end, I make maybe a plaintiff, but I believe it, an appeal in a sense to the Chinese, which is, you can live with this and in a dignified way. You will have tremendous influence, but you will not be able to prevent Vietnam from coming to a fair trade agreement with the United States, from having an independent security relationship of some kind. You will be able to, Vietnam will not be able to do certain things potentially with us that, if the competition doesn't get too acute, that we may in an ideal world like. But there's going to be a balance. I actually think that's the positive outcome we're seeking. So the ultimate goal of my strategy is that none of this ever comes true, of course, that we repeat the Cold War. This is this kind of hackneyed phrase about this is not a Cold War, obviously. But I mean, in a military sense, the Cold War was a tremendous victory in Europe, in the sense that it never happened and we achieved our goals, or well beyond our wildest dreams. So I think that's the ultimate outcome. If I could just briefly say on Taiwan, and I think it represents hopefully the sort of tone and tenor of the analysis, is I'm actually sort of 70-30 on Taiwan. I think Chris raises really important issues, and actually the differentiated credibility analog is very pointed. And I said to some Taiwan friends a couple of weeks ago, I said, look, if you don't get your act in gear, we are going to have to draw our defense perimeter behind you. And I actually talk about that in the book. So it's not something that I'm theologically against. I wish well people on Taiwan, obviously, and I think it's good that we can defend them. And I think it's worth trying to, given the benefits and bringing down the costs and the risks in the way that you talk about. And I think, Chris, the kind of thing you're talking about is really on point, that maybe I pull my punches too much. I think even since I finished the book, say, for instance, on Europe, I probably moved farther out in terms of the radical. I think we're going to have a one war military. We're already there with 20. I want to commend your tremendous influence on our defense strategy when you were at the SASC and basically set all the conditions to make the 2018 National Defense Strategy possible. So that's, in a sense, that's the main event. You and your colleagues, of course, and Senator McCain and others, but I think we may need to go that way. And I think the hopefully the framework and the logic that I'm providing will allow for that debate within that. And I really don't think I have the monopoly of the answers, but what we will need to do is we will need to have a military strategy that allows us to defend maritime allies in a way that's consistent with the American people's resolve and risk. And to your point about, are we prepared? Definitely not. Politically, militarily, etc. Hopefully this book will at least catalyze more focused thinking and not the sort of false equivalency of, it's the unipolar moment, people living 25 years ago, or we need to just come home America.
Could I add a point, Ashley?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it gets to this question about, kind of best strategy and hard power. And look, I would be the first to say, and I say it in my own book, which is kind of focused on military power, that this is probably not primarily how China is seeking to win. But what I would argue, and I think what Bridge argues, is that without the right kind of hard power and the right kind of defense strategy, we will lose. Because I think it gets into how hard power and soft power are just inherently interrelated. And I think Bridge makes the point very well in the book that at the end of the day in human affairs, it comes down to the question of, well, what would happen if we got in a fight? And if the thinking in Beijing is we would lose, put aside what that thinks about what that means for their hard power, it's going to add an element of caution to how they engage economically, diplomatically, with statecraft, with covert action, other things. But if increasingly the answer in the minds of people in Beijing is we might actually win and America might lose, I think it changes entirely the risks they're willing to run, the things they're willing to do, and how they're willing and able to use so much of this influence that they have outside of the military domain to kind of further the broader ambitions that we're all talking about here. And again, I just think we have to recognize, as I think Bridges' book does quite well, just how completely interrelated these two things are. And if we begin to lose the right kind of military capability and defense strategy, we will pay for it in the domain of non-military competition.
Absolutely. I thought that was actually one of the most powerful methodological sort of elements in the book, where you say that, this book is about ultima ratio regum, right? I'm not discussing the entire spectrum of conflict. I'm just discussing the ultimate conflict, which unfortunately has a shadow on everything else. And I want to make certain that I can survive, win if it comes to this ultimate conflict, right? And so in that sense, I think it's good to appreciate that was the methodological sort of driver that forced you to focus on that. What I thought was also interesting about the China case, about the Taiwan case, was how carefully you make the argument that a loss of Taiwan to China would actually threaten the entire foundations of US defense strategy in the Pacific. I think we're just slowly coming to grasp, that reality. And I wonder if you can spend just a few minutes sort of reiterating that argument, because why is Taiwan so important beyond the politics? Leave the politics aside. At the purely operational level, why should we care that Taiwan remains not only sort of de facto independent, but also part of this hegemonic coalition?
No, thanks. I think there are two basic reasons. One is that from a military perspective, it's very important. And I think I want to emphasize something that I'm not sure we emphasize enough these days, which is that China is already becoming a power projection military. By the end of this, by the middle of this decade, it will have 3 aircraft carriers in the region. It has nuclear powered submarines. It has very aggressive space architecture. These are things you build not by randomly. They're very expensive, huge capital intensive assets. You build them to project dominant military power in the way that we have. And just briefly, I think it's apropos, nobody would have imagined the United States would have invaded Iraq in 2003, 15 years before that. But then in 2003, and mistakenly, in my view, we did that. And that was because that was not to conquer Iraq, it was to impose our will on it. And I think that's in a sense where China's heading. And it's building a military to do precisely that. I think Taiwan is critical for 2 reasons. One is its military significance. If our position is in maritime Western Pacific, the key countries are clustered there. That's where they are. Japan isn't in the Central Pacific. It's not in the Eastern Pacific. Ditto South Korea, Philippines. basically the important economies and countries in the Pacific are in the Western Pacific. So it's right there. And there's a reason that the Empire of Japan, its first external intervention and conquest, was the island of Formosa in the last decade of the 19th century. It's essentially, and I mean, the Japanese are now saying this, thankfully. I think Jenny would know more, but is actually defending the island of Japan, or the archipelago of Japan. And if the Chinese seize that territory, they will have essentially uninhibited power projection into the Central Pacific. We will start talking about things that seem like they're from old movies about World War II in the Pacific. That our aircraft carriers might actually become useful because we will be contesting for sea control. The Chinese will adapt their military, and we will be thinking about the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan immediately. So there's a military piece. And then there's the differentiated credibility piece. And I think we can get, my position on strategic ambiguity, I don't mind ambiguity in terms of formal declaration. It doesn't need to be a treaty ally. I think, though, we should be clear in our own head, and the Chinese should understand how we behave. I don't think we should provoke them with a statement. And I think your point about discouraging Taiwan's independence, which I'm against in these circumstances, is important. But I think we're fooling ourselves too much, and I found this in the Pentagon. I think Chris maybe had similar exposure. We're confused, we're ambiguous, and that's not, ambiguity is fine publicly, but we should understand what we're going to do, and the Chinese, I think, should understand as well. And I think the differentiated credibility point really resonates there, because Taiwan is an archipelago in the Western Pacific. Well, so is the Philippines. And I mean, the Philippines, the military situation for the Philippines may not be that different in 2030 from what Taiwan is right now. I mean, if the PLA continues on its trajectory, especially if we lose Taiwan, it will be Taiwan. So why would the Philippines behave? And if we lose the Philippines and access the Philippines, we have no entryway into Southeast Asia. And by the way, no Southeast Asian country is ever going to be working with us. And I mean, in a sense, China's already wrapped up the game then. So it's divided Japan from India, isolated South Korea, if South Korea is still around. I mean, the game might be over then. I mean, that's how delicate the balance is. And I think that's the core point, is that we have so little margin. And again, our conversation, I mean, there's a lot of patting on the back about the rhetoric about Taiwan. I don't care that much about the rhetoric. We really need to be able to do it. And I think, as Chris pointed out, and Jenny's pointed out too, we're way behind, way scary behind. I mean, you have Admiral Davidson and others and Admiral Studeman talking about these things. These are sober military officers. So I'm really worried, and I'd rather over-prepare for the downside here, especially, and this gets at the security dilemma point, the kind of things that we're going to be building, the Bob Work style systems, we're all a huge fan of Bob Work, to kill ships and aircraft. Those are inherently defensive. You can't invade China with ships. You have to have a large army and tanks and artillery. That's not what we need. We're cutting those. So let's double down on that stuff that will help us defend that perimeter with such a delicate balance.
I want to bring in Jennifer quickly because you raised the original questions about the regional perspective. Based on what Bridge just said, do you have the sense that the region appreciates the significance of Taiwan, both in an operational sense as well as in the broader geopolitical sense? What is your perception?
I would agree with Bridge that this is something that we're starting to see a lot more discussion of. Taiwan kind of vanished for a while as an issue that we were all talking about. It was something that we talked about a lot in the 1990s, and we had the Chen Shui-bian years, and there was a lot going on there. Then it kind of went away, and we started talking about, well, it didn't go away, obviously. We started talking about the island disputes, the territorial disputes, kind of gray zone operations, these things, and we forgot a little bit about Taiwan. The change in the balance of power has brought it back very much to the front of many people's minds, and I agree with Bridge that we really do need to be talking about it from all sorts of different dimensions. Again, really explaining to ourselves, to the American people, and to allies and partners, what is the strategic significance? If we can't come up with that good an argument, then people aren't going to be willing to potentially pay really existential costs for this. So this is a really important thing. And then, of course, the policy, as Bridge raises, needs to be debated. I see we're getting short on time, so I'll just conclude and say, I again love the kind of clean, clear elegance of the analysis, and it's desperately needed. And I kind of felt that my reactions to it were to provide some mess to mess things up a bit in a way that's I'm not saying, oh, I've muddled it up for you. I'm just saying that as Ashley said, the clean logic relies on assumptions, and those assumptions need to be interrogated. It's things about to maintain differentiated credibility. How do we do that if the operation is like a Chinese edging Philippine vessels out of a shoal? They didn't fire any shots, right? And some people would say, oh, we're going to lose credibility in the minds of the Philippines and our allies. People are saying this now about a previous incident over Scarborough Shoal. So what should the U.S. have done in that situation to maintain this credibility that we've apparently lost? So given that messiness, given the non-kinetic means that China really might rely on, because it's already relying on them, it messes up a lot of this logic in a way that, again, just requires lots and lots of debate. But thank you again. This has been amazing.
Thank you. Bridge, I'm going to ask you to quickly respond to 3 questions from the floor. One of your fans, obviously from India, still awake at this hour, Dr. Chandrasekhar, has asked a simple question. If the US cannot solve the collective action challenges in coping with China, should it then think about unilateral action? The second question is, if your strategy is, as you say it is, what will it require in terms of public messaging for purposes of consistent support? So if you can take these 2.
Sorry, Ashley, could you repeat the last part? I lost you there for a second.
So I think I'm summarizing the discussion here. Is if narrative plays an important role in shaping public support for your strategy, what should be the substance of the messaging?
I see. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for both of those questions. Very, very interesting. I mean, I think on the collective action one and the unilateral, yes, we need to be prepared for unilateral. Again, the purpose here is ultimately to serve American interests and citizens' interests in an enlightened fashion, and to do so at a level of cost and risk that is proportioned to that. And if that requires unilateral action, for instance, I think the defense of Taiwan is a good example. I mean, I think with the exception possibly of Japan and Australia, it's very unlikely any other countries would actively participate in the direct defense of Taiwan. That's something we should do anyway. So this is Ashley pointed to the collective action problems. They're very real, but sometimes you just have to deal with the collective action problems by bearing a disproportionate risk. It's not fair. And actually, one of the things I really come to think is more of a problem that deserves a lot more analytical focus is the problem of burden sharing, which was, to Chris's point about things being dropped after the Cold War. People haven't thought rigorously about burden sharing in at least 30 years. And I think it's really important to figure out how do we do that more effectively. And that includes berating and being nice at the extremes, but also pressure. For instance, one of the things I think we should say to Taiwan's is we're going to defend Taiwan, but there are different ways we can defend Taiwan. There were, when one of the ways we got the West Germans to step up was we would say, well, there are different ways we could do it. We could defend forward, or we could drop a lot of tactical nuclear weapons on your territory. One of these is going to happen. And that I think was relevant. So I think this is an important point. Secondly, on the messaging and narrative, it's not my wheelhouse, unfortunately. The anti-hegemonic coalition, the differentiated credibility, these are not things that roll off the tongue. So I'm not sure. But I think the basic idea here is that this is in Americans' enlightened self-interest. It's in others' enlightened self-interest, in India, in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, and also in countries that don't share our political views, like Vietnam. It's in the Philippines and throughout Southeast Asia and the world. So I think that's the sort of goal. Exactly how to catalyze that will is up to others. It's not I don't claim any special expertise, but I do think it's fundamentally consistent.
Well, one of the things I liked about your book, Bridge, was not just simply the focus on defense policy and operations, but at the end of the day, the entire enterprise that you describe is aimed at protecting the United States as a vibrant society, right? You take your measure by what this does to improving the lives of Americans, the character of the polity, the strength of our society, right? And I think that has been very self-consciously, I think, part of the motivation that drove you to write the book in exactly the way you did. And so I want to ask a question which may be discomforting, but which comes from my colleague, George Perkovich. And I'm going to read it out because it's a somewhat extended question, but and I don't want to abbreviate it in any way. So George writes, in your book, you write that the United States' overall national objectives include the maintenance of a free, autonomous, and vigorous democratic Republican political order. Just the themes that I applauded you for. Yet one can make a strong argument that your public support of baseless efforts to overturn the legitimate outcome of the 2020 US presidential election helped to subvert that order and contributed to domestic discord that plays into the hands of US adversaries. What lessons would you as a foreign policy analyst draw from your own behavior in the run-up to January 6th?
Well, thanks, Ashley, and thanks to George for the question. I know this issue has actually arisen, so it's good to be able to address it forthrightly. But I fundamentally contest the premise of George's question. First off, I think it's important to be clear what I think and what I said. I support the right of elected officials, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, to use constitutional and peaceful processes to raise pressing issues, whether they're election integrity or voting rights. In that light, as George referred to, I tweeted on January 1st about Senator Josh Hawley's right to challenge election certification. Under no circumstances would I support or condone political violence, let alone insurrection in the United States. In point of fact, in a further tweet on January 6th, I condemned, and I still condemn, the violence and rioting on that day. Mob rioting, whether by the right or the left, or anyone for that matter, is the antithesis of my view of how we should operate as a constitutional republic. Look, there's a broader point here. Fair, open, and robust debate are at the heart of our constitutional republic, and especially of our public intellectual life. The last thing that we need to do is stifle it, even amidst deep and vehement domestic differences. That's the heart, in my view, of liberal society. Open and free debate, in fact, is especially important when we think about issues of such fundamental consequence as war and peace. I've really enjoyed this conversation today, in great part because it's precisely that spirit that you, Ashley, have convened here, and that the Carnegie Endowment has sponsored, and that Chris and Jenny have participated and contributed so much to. So it's been a real pleasure, and I thank you all for the engagement and insight that you brought to today's panel in that spirit.
Well, let me thank you, Bridge, for giving us the opportunity to do that. I'm really happy that we were able to engage in a fairly extensive discussion, though I always regret that we run up against the constraints of time and hence were prevented from drilling deeper into the myriad intestinal consequences of your logic, which you outlined in the book. But it was so good to see both Jennifer and Chris on the screen. I hope circumstances permit us all to meet once again in person. But until that time, and to all of you who have watched us on the screen, I bid you peace, stay safe, and I look forward to welcoming you all in person sometime soon at Carnegie. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.